Welcome to another episode of the Astro Podcast. Today we have with us Ana Duarte Rodrigues, who is the director of the Centre, the Inter-universitary Centre for the History of Science and Technology. Quite a complicated name. If it was in Portuguese, it would be easier to say it, which is a CIUHCT as for short. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Glad to have you aboard. Today we are in a more green
space.
green space instead of our usual filming with Zoom and with the internet. And this also relates to your research, which has been mainly on gardens. Can you explain that a little bit first, please?
Yes, so I've been studying gardens for more than a decade now, and I have begun this research through the eyes of history of art, and then I changed in 5-6 years ago, because it is a multidisciplinary field, so it is quite easy to do it. So I changed to the history of science, and since then I'm approaching this topic through the eyes and through the methodology of the history of science and technology.
So you're shifting from the garden as a space of beauty, art,
yes.
to the garden. What is the scientific structures and background that is behind the construction of the garden?
In fact, I think that when you look at a garden through the artistic perspective, it ends quite soon, because you study who was the landscape architect, what is the design, what are the decorative elements. On the other side, if you look at the garden through the history of science and technology, it's like a window open to the world. Well, it is always. In fact, I'm not being that fair, because a garden can be a window for you to look at the planet, to study environmental questions if you want, to study philosophical questions if you want. But in fact, through the perspective of history of science and technology, I can look at it as a laboratory. And from there, it has been very unexpected and a very interesting research. It's in fact now it's my mainstream topic of research.
Your love of
yes.
research. Great. And what were your? How shall I ask this? What surprised you when you shift from one perspective to the other?
It's more rich from my perspective. So it has much more topics to approach. I can go from the past to very up-to-date questions from today, of today. And for example, I can establish bridges with almost all the disciplines, and that is for me the most interesting thing.
Mm-hmm.
For example, even with astrology, for example, if we talk about astrological agriculture, which is one of the long lifespan fields of astrology, isn't it, since Babylonian times up until the 19th century, and not until the 17th century as usually it is. But I've studied a lot of almanacs of the late 18th century and 19th century, which were for farmers, for horticulturists, for gardeners, and here published in Portugal. And because it is a very ancient observation that when they looked at the sunflower that follows the sun, and they have always believed that, in fact, botany was ruled somehow by the moon, because it had influence on the water, the underground water, so it would have impact on the growth of plants. So that will last up until the well, I think up until today in some
In
fields,
certain way,
in a certain way, but for sure at a almost scientific level, up until the 19th century, it was most of the manuals, guides, almanacs would tell you this kind of information. In fact, that's why gardeners and farmers would buy them. So.
This is very interesting because we always know that by late 16th, early 17th century, astrology gets constricted by the church to the topics of agriculture, of course, navigation and medicine. And these are the ones that are supposed to be used, and only these are valid. And navigation in itself is quite explanatory, and there's not many connections there. Of course, medicine will be a field which will be long-lasting until the 18th century as well, although in a much different perspective. But agriculture, aside from astrometeorology, which is always it's never quite explored. At least I have never seen an explored. It's not a field that I'm familiar with, of course, so I might be missing something completely obvious, but I have never seen a deep exploration. How?
Because probably, maybe it hasn't been that explored, because the people that write about gardens and agriculture or about these fields do not know anything about astrology. In fact, I have written about the almanacs, but through a completely different perspective. I was approaching treatises on gardening since the early modern period and how they were how they circulated in Portugal.
Yes.
This in the early modern period. And then I understood, okay, but there is a totally different kind of books, smaller, for a larger public, that appear in the late 18th century. And so I thought, I was interested. Okay, now we have a totally different kind of books from treatises. Treatises were for the elites, published in the early modern period, and now we have these books for gardeners, but for a larger, and this was the starting point for my study of José Marcos Loureiro, who was the publisher of Jornal de Horticultura Prática, a very famous journal in Portugal, very famous and very good. But all that began, so this wheel of publishing for a larger public, this began in the late 18th century with almanacs. And so I was studying this, as you see, from the perspective of history of books, of ancient books, and not because I've seen that there is a very strong bridge with astrology. Maybe we should look at them together.
Yes, that would be interesting.
Again,
that would also answer a question that, if it hasn't been asked, it hasn't been explored extensively, which is what happened to astrology in Portugal in the 18th and 19th century. There is no history. Well, we don't have really a concise history of astrology in Portugal yet, but we really don't know much of what happened to the practices within the 18th century.
Okay, but I can tell you that astronomers, they write about themselves as being astronomers. They are doing these books, these almanacs, these small books, which are delicious, because in Portuguese it is delicious, the title, like Manual para agricultores pomareiros, so those that have groves, like orange groves or something like that, and gardeners, so they say agricultores pomareiros e jardineiros, so it is really interesting. So they are delicious books, so we should maybe look at them together. And they say that they are astronomers doing that, and so they are it's a kind of guide, so that they will tell you when it is the best season to do some kind of activity in gardens or in farms, and they will do this month by month.
Okay. Yes. So they will have that astronomical details of the moons and the seasons.
Everything about the moon, everything.
That will be interesting to explore. I think that's worthwhile exploring aspect to see exactly how astrology is implied and what's the role it plays.
And what kind of wisdom is behind that books, because of course I was only reading what they tell about agriculture and the gardening, but I would like to know, in fact, how expert were they in astronomy, astrology?
Yeah. Yes, no, yeah. And how it's applied, really, that's interesting, how it's applied, because we know that from books, the principles of botanics, books on plants and herbs, like Culpeper's Complete Herbal, which has the characteristics of the planets of each herb.
Yeah.
So it makes a connection between herbs and medicine, medical properties coming from the planets and the attributes. But now we're talking about more practical application of when do you plant it,
absolutely.
when do you collect it, and how
for
does that work?
harvesting, for seedling, everything, sowing.
Which is a long tradition, because I was thinking also of the Nabatean.
Yes, no, this comes from ancient times, but this is, as I was telling, even if in the 17th century, for example, in England, astrology is no more considered like a field of knowledge as astronomy, isn't it? Then, for example, with agriculture, it's not like that. It goes at least up until the 19th century. It is considered.
Yes, so
considered and used.
Yes, so it's something to look forward to looking attentively. Yes, because indeed it's a field I think needs exploration. Agriculture, this astrology and agriculture. How does that maintain itself?
I think, for example, the properties of the plants that were talking about, for example, as the sunflower that is ruled by the sun. That's why the sunflower follows the sun. But for example, I think the strongest connection between the planets and agriculture is the moon and its influence, or the belief of its influence on water, on the groundwater. And because of that, then it will rule all the plant growth.
Yeah, exactly. It will limit and command all plant growth. That's interesting. Oh. A new line of field is opened up.
Absolutely.
Always interesting to explore.
So you see, this is the most interesting thing about gardens. I have a topic to talk with everybody.
Exactly.
There's always a bridge. There's always something in a garden, something that appears there. For example, another thing that I was talking with Elena the other day is about cosmogonies, or cosmos, or representations of cosmos in gardens that are very strong in the early modern period. And we have two major cases in Portugal. The Palace of Fronteira, which is probably the most acknowledged garden in Portugal, because it is one of the most beautiful gardens of the world of the 17th century. And then we have another one, which is the Palace of the Bishop of Castelo Branco, so more to the north. And it also has the same kind of construction. And so here you have these gardens still follow the design of the Villa di Castello di Medici in the surroundings of Florence. And so they have like this square, which is still a very Renaissance design and not a Baroque as we could expect in the 17th or 18th century. So you have this square, and this square tells you that you have this limitedness, which is something important in cosmogonies. And here you are going to recreate the world. The world is here. So beyond the iconological message that we have at the Palace of Fronteira, which is quite rare in a garden. In a garden, we usually have examples of decorum, which is the subjects that are appropriated to a certain context. This is something that was established in Renaissance and guides all the iconography, almost all iconography. When it does not respect, when you find a topic, a subject, in a place that does not follow this, that was established by Armenini in a Renaissance treatise, then you have to ask, what is the message of the patron? what is behind it. And this is not, so iconological readings are, you cannot always do that in a garden. Because what you always, most of the time, have there are the proper subjects. So you have a Flora, a Pomona, a Venus, a Ceres, the goddess of agriculture. In a garden, it's what it is expected. If you find there something that is beyond this, then you have to ask, why are they there? And so at the Palace of Fronteira, you have, it was built just after the Restoration War, so the war between the Spanish and the Portuguese between 1640 and 1668. And so the political issue at that time was very strong. And so Dom João Mascarenhas, the Marquis of Fronteira, makes it clear that the monarchy, the Portuguese monarchy, can only exist while there is a nobility to support it. That is just like this in front of the water mirror. It's clear. But then you have the pleasure garden, so you have dancers, Venus, Apollo, all in the parterre. It is a pleasure garden. And then you have one thing more, which is this reconstruction of the world. So like time and space are there. It's a closed space, closed by the square. It has a wall all around, and then it is divided, it is symmetrical. It has a certain order, like gardens usually want to have, because this is what this is the boundary between them and wilderness, so natura natura. And so you have here this order, and you have like all the activities that occur each month, all the signs of the zodiac, and then the planets that rule all this, so the sun and the moon. So you see, so and this kind of construction then will also appear at Castelo Branco, at the Palace of the Bishop, in Castelo Branco, in a different way. There you don't have, because all this is depicted on tiles, probably made from engravings that the Marquis of Fronteira had in his library, which are still there. So the library, this is a very unique case, because the Palace of Fronteira is still in the same family since it was built. So you still have in the library their books, the books from the 17th century. It's absolutely amazing. And the engravings, all that. We see also a lot of mistakes when they are writing, the artists are writing, so we understand that those were not very educated artists, probably artisans to whom the Marquis gave the engravings, and so they could reproduce. So it's a very interesting story. So at the Palace of the Bishop, we do not have this these designs depicted on tiles, but we have sculptures of granite, and we have also this medieval way of seeing the world, which is with all the 4 seasons, 4 elements, 4 parts of the world, 4 doctors of the church, 4 cardinal virtues. So you have all this there. So, and the structure is built with this. So this is also interesting to maybe to check if it has some bridges with the. In the case of Fronteira, it's more obvious because you have the planets there, the signs of zodiac. But I also think that in Castelo Branco, this kind of order, everything is divided into 4. Then it has something also connected with the signs of the zodiac. There are 12, but then they can be divided into.
Well, there is definitely a cosmological message there, in which the form plays part. It's not as explicit as with the planets, but it's there in any way. And they're more or less the same period, as you said.
Not really. In fact, the Palace of Fronteira, 1718, so we are talking about 1670s, yes. And the other 17... between 1725 and 36. Well,
Right.
but already in the reign of King John V. Yeah, and it is made by a bishop. Then, besides this, it has a lot of religious iconography, as it is expected. So,
And I was curious, have you ever seen any in the almanacs you were talking about? Well, here we have an explicit connection, not to astrology, through cosmology
Yeah.
with the planets, but have you ever seen mentions of the planets in almanacs that you studied at that period?
yes, I think, yes, I'm sure. I don't have here the book because I brought it, and it was because it's there.
Perhaps we'll put
yeah,
an image later
yes,
on here
we
at this
can.
point.
Because they are really interesting, and it's said there. Yes, they are.
Okay.
The planets are included,
Okay. Well, perfect.
and the moon, everything about the moon.
Of course. Yeah. No, it's very interesting. I think it's it is. I think it's a very nice way to show how astrology. It is something that we have passed on to our various podcast interviews and research. Astrology is embedded in almost
Yes.
every worldview of this period, of the pre-modern
Yes,
period.
I in fact, I was convinced that it was convinced. I was convinced that astrology was seen as a field of knowledge,
Mhm.
as astronomy, as
Yeah.
maths, and as all the others since Babylonian times up until the 17th century. I think this is what we think. But then I remembered my almanacs.
Mhm.
Well, not in agriculture. And then I read something about astrological agriculture, and well, okay, but in Portugal it is up until the 19th century. And I think, in fact, in agriculture it is the long lifespan of astrology as a knowledge that is considered
A support.
a support,
Yeah.
yes, and useful.
Yeah.
So when for other fields it was already when astronomers were a different career from astrology up
Yeah.
since the 17th century. But I think it's in fact with Newton that, okay, now we have a different universal law.
Mhm.
So
Things
yes,
shift
it's
considerably,
shifted
yes.
completely. Yeah. Completely, or
We see still, it's not a period that I'm completely familiar with, but we do still see astrology, some remnant of astrology in astrometeorology, so
yes,
they still
I imagine.
establish some connections with moon cycles mainly and sun
Mhm.
cycles, which then develops into meteorology as we know it today. But still with some planetary association and with some astrological association. We have medicine, which runs throughout the
Yes,
18th
because of
century.
childbirth,
Yeah.
isn't it? Because many people still also because of the water,
Yeah, the same reason.
the same reason they thought that it has some influence
There's some
on child.
physiological
Yes, of course.
influence always present. But then, of course, what concerns predictions and the predictions on fate, that is completely marginalized, of course. It's
Mhm.
still being done in some types of almanacs, but it's no longer within the range of acceptable scientific knowledge.
Yes, or useful.
Yeah, but
yes.
then we have also agriculture, which so it seems that it does
Yes,
stay
up
on.
until the first, or up until the middle of the 19th century is for sure, because I have studied the almanacs and they're
Yeah.
all about that.
No, that's very interesting. I think that's again, as I said before, a good path to explore and see what.
With gardens, which was so unexpected.
Yeah.
But I think also that one of the most interesting points about astrology is in fact in Renaissance.
Mhm.
Because in Renaissance, when we think about Renaissance, about humanists, and that they have this encyclopedical knowledge, so they know from astrology to religion, they know from mathematics to sculpture, they know everything.
Yes.
When they were writing about Alberti, nobody knew if they should write if he was a scientist or an artist. What is Leonardo da Vinci?
Yes, yeah.
So, and there in that period, I think then astrology can bridge, can establish bridges with all this field of knowledge, which is the richest thing. But of course, we can go up until the 19th century with agriculture.
And probably until the present time, because I think
Yes,
there
I know
must be some
that-
practices and variances still today that use that type of knowledge and try to revive it in some
But
way.
If I have the almanacs up until the 19th century, which are very considered, for example, then it is also the starting point of agronomy as a field of academic study. And so maybe it's then we have two different paths, one that still uses almanacs and then the other one that has more scientific ambitions.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Well, I think we have covered a lot of terrain, and it was very interesting to find out more about this connection. It wasn't expected.
Yes, I imagine. It's
Yes.
like I say, with gardens we can
You have the
go
world in
everywhere. Yes.
Literally.
Literal.
Yes. So, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation. Congratulations for your project. I wish you the best of luck here in this research center and abroad. Whatever.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.